All right. It's been 2 weeks since we last met, and we were on the topic of Christians' relationship with the state with the matter of voting for political candidates for office. Discussion began in October prior to the presidential election. This may turn out to be the last episode, if you want to call it that, last lesson, last class on this topic. But since it's been a while, I'm just going to kind of backtrack a little bit. I had shared this quotation, which was by I think it was a mid-3rd century Christian named Origen, and he was countering a claim by a pagan named Celsus, and Celsus was accusing the Christians of not doing their patriotic duty. They were rather aloof to the affairs of state, and Origen took the position that Christians have a higher calling than to get involved in the affairs of state. And if those who govern in the church and are called rulers of the divine nation, that is the church, rule well, they rule in accordance with the divine commands and never suffer themselves to be led astray by worldly policy. And it is not for the purpose of escaping public duties that Christians decline public offices, but they may reserve themselves for a diviner or more necessary service in the church of God for the salvation of men. And this service is at once necessary and right. They take charge of all of those that are within, with the church that is, that they may day by day lead better lives, and of those that are outside without, that they may come to abound in holy words and in deeds of piety. And that while thus worshiping God truly and training up as many as they can in the same way, they may be filled with the word of God and the law of God, and thus be united with the supreme God through his Son, the Word, wisdom, truth, and righteousness, who unites to God all who resolve to conform their lives in all things to the law of God. So rather than countering Celsus's accusation of standing aloof, Origen supports and says that's actually right, but we do it for a more nobler cause. We don't get dragged down into debates about worldly policy. We don't want to serve as officers in public governments. We have a higher, more nobler calling. So that was maybe from 2 weeks ago. And then I had shared how the Amish stood out in this last election as rather surprising. If you take this 87, I think Daniel, you had pointed out that may be a doctored sign because there's a zero missing. If that's supposed to be 87,000, they got the comma in the right place. So it's either 87,000 or it's 8,700. Nonetheless, you clearly have the Amish, who normally stand aloof, kind of like the early Christians, from the affairs of the world, making a public statement for a particular candidate here. And we're scratching our heads, why did the Amish make such a statement here? They normally don't come out in such large numbers. And there's this video, I'm trying to remember if this is the video. We were having problems. I think there was 2 videos.
So did the Amish turn out for Trump after all? Well, that was his campaign's big hope,
Okay.
but the experts were doubtful.
So last time we were having technical difficulties and we couldn't get any audio. So I'm going to play this clip again, and this could explain why the Amish came out in large numbers this time around.
So did the Amish turn out for Trump after all? Well, that was his campaign's big hope, but the experts were doubtful. The Amish have stayed away from politics for 300 years, and traditionally only 5% of them vote because they're deeply religious and they see themselves as members of God's kingdom, not man's. This year, though, we've discovered that was very different. They did indeed vote. They came out to vote, and by the Amish community's own estimate, between 50 to 60% of them did, and they told us almost unanimously for Trump. Why? Well, to start with, they've been bombarded with Trump messaging, like the sign behind me here in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, the epicenter of Amish country. Do you want to lose your freedoms and rights, it asks. And there was one more big issue. They firmly oppose women leaders like Kamala Harris because they say that's what the Bible teaches. So what does it mean for the future? Well, a block of traditionally non-voters falling off the fence for Republicans could have significant consequences in Pennsylvania, which has been the key swing state for years. But was this year a one-off? We'll have to wait until 2028 to find out.
Okay, so we have to wait to 2028, Lord willing, if we're still here, as to see whether this is an aberration or whether the Amish return back to a more aloofness as far as getting involved in politics. Whether to, what I could probably do, I didn't do it, to figure out whether that was supposed to be 8,700 or 87,000, is to figure out how many Amish there are in Pennsylvania. If there's a 50 and 60% turnout, you can probably figure out what number that was supposed to be. Walter?
You did get my curiosity up, so I did some research. According to the census, there are 92,600 Amish in Pennsylvania total. More than half of them are under voting age. So if you're looking at that number, you couldn't have 87,000 voting for Trump unless something really funny is going on there, if the census is to be believed.
Okay, so we'll take it as 8,700. So the gentleman was saying 50 to 60%. Maybe that's 50 to 60% of voting Amish, those who are eligible to vote. Clearly, if 50% are under voting age, they would not be able to vote. Nonetheless, the Amish have traditionally remained aloof, and yet they turned out in much, much larger numbers than they have in the past. And I had brought up the question, how is this going to play out if you've let the genie out of the bag, or the bottle? Where might this take the Amish 50 years from now, 100 years from now, assuming Jesus hasn't returned? And then I had put forth the hypothetical, well, let's say Christadelphians started to become more politically active. Let's say we started voting in national elections. How would that change us as a group? 50 years from now, 100 years from now, what would we look like if we become more politically active? If half the people here vote one way and the other half of the ecclesia votes another way, we start talking about political matters more from the pulpit or from the podium. How would that change us? Okay, and I think this is a video from the WCF, and this is what I think we put the microphone up to it, but I want to play it anyhow again. Even those who in the WCF video who were in favor of voting, they had to admit one thing, and this clip is the only time where all 5 young people agreed on one thing, and it's interesting what they agreed on.
One of the things that I personally am afraid of, if we were as a body to start voting, is would this then cause more justifications for division? Because we already see that in just purely humanistic terms, there's a lot more animosity between the Democrats and the Republicans.
That is absolutely true. Voting just brings it more to the forefront.
Right.
It makes it more visible.
I absolutely understand that. It's one of my fears too. I have known situations where people are already taking very strong political positions on one side or the other, and certain people have felt so unwelcome within the body that they have felt that they could no longer remain.
I am really happy that, like, as in our church community, there's never been a situation where, and it's because we don't vote, but there's never been a situation where, like, a leader is telling us what we should think or vote about, like, political things. Because I agree that I think that would be damaging.
Not to mention illegal.
Well, I mean, the thing.
That's just campaigning, but
Yeah, but you know, there are a lot of churches where,
They vote as
as a block, yeah.
That is so puzzling, considering she was the one advocating for voting. And yet she admits if we become politically active, it would be damaging. I can't connect the two positions. I feel like, okay, I'm taking the position now, voting is something that's good. But then I acknowledge it can be damaging to our community. How do you reconcile that? I can't. But this is the only time, although we didn't get, I don't think we got a word from the African American sister. Nonetheless, this is about the only time where there's a large majority that is favoring the traditional Christadelphian position. Okay. So going on that theme of damaging to our community, I brought up the metaphor of leaven. And this illustration here, photograph time lapse, of what happens to a lump of dough when leaven works its way through the dough. And I tried to then steer us into this study on leaven. And the quotation from Mark is what we then tried to focus on, which is, Jesus charged them, saying, "Take heed, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod." The leaven of the Pharisees, I think we all agree, because pretty much it was explained, are the teachings that the Pharisees taught the people. That's kind of like a fence around the law. And they added to the law in order to try to protect the law. But Jesus was saying this was leaven, to be compared with leaven. It was not helpful. Although they may have been well-intentioned, it actually had a detrimental effect. Now, the question is left then, what is the leaven of Herod? And I had shared, if you keep reading in Mark, Jesus never says what the leaven of Herod is. He never does. And this is the complete passage, and when you get to the bottom there, that's the end of the chapter. And you'll notice Jesus never says the leaven of Herod is X. He just doesn't. So what is the leaven of Herod? And I try to give you a little bit of background about Herod. Let's see. This is the parallel passage from Matthew, and you'll notice the leaven of Herod is missing. Now you have the leaven of Pharisees, but no leaven of Herod. Instead, you have Sadducees. That makes this even more interesting. What is the leaven of Herod? What is the leaven of the Sadducees? Are they the same thing? Are they two different things? Did I already answer that?
I think he answers the question. Can you go back to the other longer passage that you just had up a minute ago? I mean, I've always kind of looked at the miracle of the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes as, and that kind of seems to be the answer there in verse 19. When I break the 5 loaves among the 5,000, how many baskets full of fragments took ye up? And they say unto him 12. So it's, I mean, he answers the question with a question, it looks like. But this idea that instead of, just worrying about themselves or all that resources going to certain individuals, they're then saying we can spread those resources around.
Right. Based upon Mark, okay, you could take the position, he explained it being a reference to the feeding of the multitude.
Yeah.
Can someone go to Matthew? Maybe you're thinking what I'm thinking, Walter. The Matthew passage, if you read it, he actually talks about, he wasn't referring to the feeding of the multitude. Is that what you're thinking of, Walter?
I was going to say the leaven of the Sadducees is the fact that there's no resurrection.
Yeah.
That's the false doctrine.
Can someone see what was the Matthew passage? Matthew 6. I'm going to look up Matthew 6. Where's my phone?
I can read it, Phil. What verses did you want?
Do you find what I'm talking about? He pretty much shoots down the multitude explanation. It wasn't referring to the bread. So Matthew 16, watch out, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. Okay, it's Sadducees. And they began to discuss this among themselves, saying, we did not take any bread. And Jesus, realizing this, said, oh, you little trust, why are you discussing amongst yourselves that you do not have any bread? Do you not understand? Do you not remember the 5 loaves, 5,000, so forth? How is it that you do not perceive that I did not speak about bread? But beware of the leaven and the Pharisees. Then, verse 12, they understood that he did not tell them to beware of the leaven of bread, but of the doctrine of the Pharisees and Sadducees. So we're talking about doctrines. We're not talking about miracles or literal bread. Okay? So I would say we haven't figured out yet what the leaven of the Sadducees is and the leaven of Herod is. And Jesus, in other places, talks about how the Pharisees are, blind leaders of the blind, and they make void the word of God by their traditions. That pretty much fits the idea of the leaven of the Pharisees. But he never talks about the Sadducees. And he never talks about Herod other than he was a fox. Okay, so in fact, that's the passage I was looking for. And then we were talking about how well you have set aside the commandment of God in order to uphold your tradition. Talking to the Pharisees. And we're back to here, the leaven of Herod. So what is the leaven of Herod? And this is where I got into, we're trying to talk a little bit more about who Herod was. Now Herod depends on what Herod you're talking about. There are multiple Herods in the Bible. The first one we come across is frequently, though it's not mentioned, I don't think, the Great, but he's known by historians as Herod the Great because he was the first amongst many Herods that would follow, just like Julius Caesar was the first Caesar, and then the title Caesar was applied or taken by subsequent emperors. The same thing happened to the name Herod. Herod was a name which then became a title. Herod the Great lived at the time of Jesus' birth. There I have a little portrayal of Herod having lots of little baby Herods. Not that many, okay, but you got the idea. This is what happened to the name Herod. I just remember I was going to bring a coin, a picture of a coin, and I forgot to do that. Because on one of the coins it had one of Herod's sons shaking the hand of the emperor, Roman emperor, in front of the temple of Jupiter, and on the coin it said, friend of Caesar. And this is really what the position of Herod amounted to. He was called king, but that was essentially a title he gave to himself. Herod was an Edomite. He was an Edomite, being a descendant from Esau, which had been a brother of Jacob. And the Edomites were faced in the time of the Maccabees to either be killed when the Maccabees were on the rampage, on the ascendancy, or they can convert to Judaism, and they wisely, well, they chose Judaism. So you ended up having the Edomite tribes now embracing Judaism. But Herod's father, I think his name was Antipater. Anyway, he was a governor in the land in the middle of the 1st century BC, and it was recommended that he be appointed by Caesar to govern the land of Palestine. And then when he died, the next likely individual who would take over was Herod, who we refer to as Herod the Great, who killed the babies in the time of Jesus' birth. And each time, though, you had to get, this was not, like King David and King Solomon. It wasn't God put you on the throne. This was Caesar, the Roman emperor, would put you on the throne. And it was no given that you, just because you were the son of Herod, that you were going to be given, the position of governor. You had to remain a friend of Caesar to remain in power. Okay. Now, I try to and keep that in mind. You have to please the king foremost. At the same time, you give lip service because you're an Edomite converted to Judaism. You have to give lip service to the teachings of the Jews. So you've got two constituencies. I don't know if that's the right term. You've got to please the Caesar, who put you in position, and you have to please the Jews who you rule over. And this created a bit of a complex, funny situation where Herod the Great would build or improve the temple grounds, but then he would put an eagle representing Rome over the gates leading into the temple. It's like having 1 foot in and 1 foot out. You're trying to straddle the fence. You're trying to please the emperor, and you're trying to please the Jewish people and their religious faith. One thing that he had control over, besides the people, was the priesthood. And this is where the Sadducees come into the picture. The Sadducees were those who were maintaining the temple and the worship services. And Josephus says, the historian Josephus said that in a 100-year period, that, let me see if I can find the historian Josephus tells us that there were 28 high priests in the 107 years from the beginning of Herod the Great's reign to the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So in 107 years, you had 28 high priests. Do the math. It's roughly what, 1 every 4 years? That doesn't happen. I mean, unless they're super bad health and bad physical health, you don't have high priests dropping over dead every 4 years. What was happening was that the high priesthood became essentially a political position, and you would pay for the privilege of being high priest, and you would pay Herod or one of his sons. So now we're seeing a political element insert itself into the worship of the one God in the religious activities, the temple services. You now have a political figure controlling who the high priest is. And the Sadducees, again, were in charge of the temple service. The Pharisees did the teaching, but the Sadducees did the running of what was taking place on the Temple Mount. So, by controlling who became high priests and manipulating them once in power, Herod and his successors could keep threats against his rule in check and ensure that the highest and most powerful religious voice in the land would never contend against him. Think about that. You have the political power, but you don't have the religious power. But if you essentially own the one who has the religious power, you now have power over the realm of religion and the realm of politics. And I would suggest you're beginning to see a little bit of what the leaven of Herod and the leaven of the Sadducees is. This mixture of the religious with the political, and how the religious was now being controlled by the political. So Herod was able to turn the position of the high priest from that of a servant of God to that of little more than a political pawn and a loyal press secretary who owed allegiance to Herod. And since Herod had been put in place and was kept in place by the Romans, the religious support given to Herod by the Sadducees was a sign that the Sadducees approved of the Roman presence in Palestine. And if you do history on the Pharisees and the Sadducees were the ones that were worldly, who didn't believe that there was an afterlife. So they were in for what they could get in that life. And they were very Hellenistic. They approved of the introduction of the Greek way of life into Palestine. It was the Pharisees that put their foot down and said, no, 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 we need to think of the afterlife. We need to be considering God and living for him so that we can be prepared for an afterlife. And the Pharisees believed in an afterlife. And the ultimate exposure of this control that the political had over the religious, you see this when Jesus is on trial. And the high priest Caiaphas' attitude at the time was, we have no king but Caesar. We have no king but Caesar. That's John 19, verse 15. And that's when they were deciding whether to crucify Jesus or Barabbas. So at this time, we no longer have Herod the Great. We have Herod Antipas, and one of many sons of Herod the Great. And when we enter the book of Acts, we have yet another Herod. This one's Herod Agrippa. You can, I guess, catch on, Herod becomes a title. And Herod Agrippa was the one who put James, the Apostle James, to death. Herod Agrippa was the one that put Peter into prison. So you see, there's been many, many Herods that have come on the scene. So when Jesus says, beware of the leaven of Herod, he's not talking about the leaven of Herod the Great. And I would think this pattern, like I said, it was 107 years of controlling the high priesthood. This wasn't something limited to just one Herod. This became a standard practice. That needs to be kept in mind as we try to figure out what the leaven of Herod is. Because between Antipas and Agrippa, there was only a combined 10-year span. And I think Jesus was trying to tell us more than just be on your guard against a 10-year worry. Let's see. I've got a note here that according to Josephus, the Sadducees were part of the upper social and economic echelon of Judean society, which could or would explain why they would want to have close ties to Herod. And as a whole, the Sadducees fulfilled various political, social, and religious roles, including maintaining the temple. They developed a reputation for corruption. There's this belief that the Essenes were the ones that were out in the Dead Sea area, from which we get the Dead Sea Scrolls. They had isolated themselves because they believed that the high priesthood had become corrupt. And some will even argue that John the Baptist was an Essene. Anyway, back to the Sadducees. They developed a reputation for corruption. The temple in Jerusalem was a formal center political and government leadership in ancient Israel. So you can perhaps see how the two groups, the Sadducees and the Herodian family, having similar interests and goals, would find opportunities to work together. So here's a list of some things that the Sadducees were responsible for. They administered the state domestically. They represented the state internationally. They participated in the Sanhedrin, which was the council of elders who would judge legal matters. The Sadducees collected taxes. The Sadducees equipped and led the Judean army, or I guess soldiers. And the Sadducees regulated relations with the Romans. All these activities the Sadducees were involved in, of course, not to mention the oversight of the temple. So you can see there's a very large component to, I might be behind, yeah. There's the list of some of the responsibilities. So you can see there's a large political component to the sect of the Sadducees. Now it's true that in the scriptures, the Sadducees come across pretty much as a religious sect, but that appearance is actually misleading. The Sadducees were greatly motivated and involved in the politics of the state. And I would suggest to you that this should be the clue that helps us unravel the mystery of the leaven of Herod. And I say this on account of Matthew chapter 16, which we looked at earlier. I think I may have the wrong reference on the slide. And here's the comparison. They're really parallel passages, and I would argue that the leaven of Herod is the leaven of the Sadducees and vice versa. That we're not talking about three things, we're talking about two things. So then it becomes, why is Matthew saying one thing, referring to it as the leaven of the Sadducees, and why is Mark referring to the leaven of Herod? And I would suggest to you that the reason why you have the two different terms is the audience to whom Matthew and Mark were writing to. And Matthew has been seen to be more of a Jewish gospel, and if you were a Jew, you would have understood how the Sadducees fit into your culture and their bad track record. Mark's is more of a gospel to the Gentiles, in which case they would not have been familiar with who the Sadducees were, but they would have been familiar with Herod as a governor. So I would suggest to you that's the reason why you have a difference in terms here. It's clearly the same passage, same reference, but we do have two different terms for the second half of this warning. So I'm trying to make the case that the Sadducees and the leaven of Herod reveal a political element creeping in to the world of religion, back down, the faith of Judaism. And 2,000 years have passed since Jesus gave this warning, beware of the leaven of Herod. And anyone with a surface familiarity with the history of Christianity knows how the church became corrupted through the mixing of religion and politics over the centuries. You could just name the Spanish Inquisition and the Crusades, just two examples, notorious and awful examples of how the church and the state combine into something hideous. Today, we don't have that mixing, at least definitely not in the US. There are some countries that have state churches, especially in Russia today. It's a really good example. this is, kind of what happens, one of the things that can happen when the political element, or we call it maybe yeast, works its way into Christianity. We end up putting the cross on a shield, and we go to war in the name of Jesus. Wrap your head around that one. Or we burn people at the stake because they don't agree with our particular understanding of scriptures. This is what that political leaven in the body of Christ can do. Give it enough time, and it can make it turn out to be something much different than what it started as. Okay. And the only way you can really observe the effects of leaven is how? If you were just to wake up and you had this big bowl of dough and it's been fully leavened, ready to go in the oven, and that's your first exposure to dough and bread making, you wouldn't necessarily know it started out as a tiny little lump. So take that into the world of Christianity. If all you know about Christian history is what has happened since you were born, you're going to be totally unaware of the change that has occurred to Christianity over 2,000 years, 20 centuries. As important as it is to know the Bible, I would say it's almost as important to know Christian history. If you don't know what has preceded you, how do you know that you are where you're supposed to be, or how things have changed from how they were originally? How many people knew about Origen's words about 2nd, 3rd century Christianity's aloofness from political affairs? I would say probably no one here knew that. Why? How many of us go around studying Celsus and Origen? How many of us study Constantine the Great in the 4th century? How about even the Protestant Reformation? How about the Church of England? How about anything prior to 1860, 1840? And I even question how many of us even know about our own roots, where we get our Christadelphian name. One of the greatest ways to lose your identity is to forget where you came from, to get detached from your roots. In 1864, John Thomas, referring to the birth of our own denomination, wrote the following: "There was, however, a denomination not known to the ignorance of legislative wisdom." And this is in the context of the American Civil War. A draft is on the doorstep, and he is penning an exemption from military service. And he writes, "There was, however, a denomination not known to the ignorance of legislative wisdom," referring to the government. "It was relatively very small, but nevertheless a denomination and a name contrary to and distinct from all others upon earth. It comprehended all those who with Paul repudiated the use of carnal weapons. The members of this name or denomination are not politicians. They are not patriots." Sounds very much like what Origen was saying in the 3rd century to Celsus. "They take no part in the contentions of the world. Politicians, patriots, and factionists have therefore no scriptural claim or identity with the conscience of this name or denomination. The ecclesias of this name," referring to the name Christadelphian, "conscientiously opposes and earnestly protests against brethren in Christ having anything to do with politics or arms bearing in the service of the sin powers of the world under any conceivable circumstances or conditions whatsoever." That is our heritage. That is our heritage. I can understand not being familiar with Origen or Constantine or the Protestant Revolution, but if we're not familiar with our heritage and how we got our name, we're going to meld into the world and become like the Amish might be 100 years from now, participating in political elections and becoming the object of t-shirts saying Amish for Trump. So I've spent 8 weeks now, I don't know how many people have been counting, probably maybe more weeks than some would want, 8 weeks on this topic of whether it's appropriate for followers of Jesus to participate in political elections. And this discussion was the result of the WCF video that was released back in October, just prior to the presidential election. 3 of the 5 young people in that video seemed to come across as advocating voting for political candidates. That was a proper thing that a Christadelphian or a Christian could do. And the only justification that they provided was that voting could potentially help those who are less fortunate than ourselves. Their belief was that only through the political process could major changes take place that would benefit the underprivileged. And I've stated several times that, yes, in theory, and I will grant them that in theory, such a position may turn out to be true. It is possible that through a government decision or policy, which is inaugurated by bringing somebody into office, that it is true that that could, in theory, bring about something good. I don't deny that. However, I've tried to, in the last 8 weeks, also shared the cons, the negatives that would result if we were, as a body, to partake of that, well, not partake, but to take that position. And at least a dozen different things I have covered. And I don't know how much time we got. I don't have my glasses. Okay. So what I was going to do was actually go through, because I don't think very many people here have been in every one, and I could be wrong, but attendance can always be spotty. I've gone and listed in very brief format, I think 12 or 13 of the reasons why it's a bad idea for a follower of Jesus to vote, okay? So I've been trying to be fair to the other side, but I do think if you just stand back and look at it from a statistic, if that's even the right term, statistical position, the negatives, the cons, way outweigh the benefits. Okay, so I will hold off on going through, we'll make that as the review next week. And then there's going to be one other thing I want to talk about, which will be a segue back into our anti-Semitism class. Okay, we're going to deal with a real life situation that happened during World War II. So the question was, and if you got a mic or? Okay, with the increasing secularism in our schools, in our country, would it be a sin to run for office as a school board member? If it is a sin, what about attending school board meetings and voicing concerns about LGBT+ agenda and having biological males participating in girls' sports? I mean, you could approach this, I mean, this could be a class in itself. First thing I would say, what's going to happen, I'm not here to say it's a sin to do X or sin to do Y, okay? I don't even like bringing up the 3 sisters that disagree, and I'm not going to say they're sinning. I'm just saying there are a lot of cons with taking that particular route. So I'm not about to say it's a sin to run for office. I will say that at least in the Richmond Chapel, I think part of our rules that holding political office, I think maybe one, no, maybe it's serving in the military. Anyway, let's go back. The problem that you have is, where are you going to stop with this? If I were to grant and say it's okay for someone to run as a school board member, well, someone then is going to say, well, why can't I run as maybe treasurer for the county, or representative for the state of Virginia, or the governor of Virginia, or a senator for the United States, or the president of the US. Where are you going to stop that? Are you going to keep saying, is it a sin to run as president of the US? Is it a sin to be a senator? Is it a sin to be a governor? Where are you going to stop, okay? That would be the first thing I would say. Is it a sin about attending school board meetings? I don't see how it could be a sin to just listen to what's going on and be aware of what's going on in your community. Is it a sin to voice concerns? No. I mean, I have no problem. You can send a letter to your representative and say, hey, this is a problem. You know, you need to fix the sewer. You need to fix a policy. You're just voicing your opinion amongst other people who would do the same thing. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. I don't see this as a very strong argument for overturning 150 years of Christadelphian heritage, and then all the 13 concerns which we'll address next week, which you have created a potential 13 problems. I just don't see how that overweighs the negatives if you were to grant what the questioner is suggesting in that question. Anyway, thank you.